Forgive me, folks, I have a mess in front of me. We have one appeal tonight, and that's an appeal for an interpretation. It's number 1064, wherein East Point Energy appeals the zoning board administrator Sarah Davis's opinion on October 5th, 2022, which withdrew her and revised her February 14th, 2022 opinion in an undated earlier opinion of the prior zoning administrator Thomas Lane. And if you think you need a scorecard to get through this, welcome to the club. In this appeal, East Point Energy is requesting an interpretation as to whether or not they should be considered a public utility facility. Along with that appeal, we have a list of contiguous landowners to whom notification of this meeting has been sent, and we also have an affidavit of publication from the Poughkeepsie Journal as to the publication of this meeting. I'm sure you've all of you who have been here before are aware, but all testimony, is given under oath and is subject to laws of perjury. Would someone representing East Point like to talk about this, or?
Yes.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm here tonight on behalf of my client, East Point Energy. My name is Alexandra Downey. I'm from the firm of Corbly, Gartland, and Rapelier. As Mr. Dunn has stated, East Point Energy is requesting an interpretation of the Town of Pleasant Valley zoning code, and specifically the determination by the zoning administrator dated October 5th, 2022, that East Point Energy grid scale battery project is not a public utility facility. Ms. Davis's decision dated October 5th, 2022 stated, among other things, that East Point Energy is a private for-profit entity whose business purposes appear to be to trade in electricity market rather than operate for public service purposes, as New York's investor-owned utilities do. Also, East Point will not be directly regulated by New York's Public Service Commission. In sum, East Point is not a public agency or especially franchised public utility as required by the Pleasant Valley Code, section 98-103. So if you turn to Pleasant Valley's Town Code, section 98-103, the Town Code defines public utility facility as an installation used by a public agency or especially franchised public utility to supply or transmit electric, gas, water, sewage disposal, cable television, telephone service, or other utility service, excluding electric power plants and gas wells. Included in such facilities are substations, high voltage transmission lines, pump stations, water supply wells, water towers, and telephone stations. Utility distribution facilities serving customers directly are considered customary accessory uses, not public utility facilities. That's the end of the town's code of the definition of a public utility facility. So if you go back to Ms. Davis's decision dated October 5th, 2022, none of the statements that she made in that decision are requirements under the town code. The only requirements under the town code are that the installation be used by a public agency or specially franchised public utility to supply or transmit electric. There's an exclusion as to power plants, which this is not. And then there's an inclusion as to substations. And there's no differentiation between the different types of substations. And there's an exclusion of utility distribution facilities serving customers directly, which are customary accessories, which this is not. Keeping that in mind, the definition, I'll talk a little bit about the project so I can better explain as to how this project falls within your town code of a public utility facility. So the proposed project is a 10 megawatt, 4-hour duration battery. The footprint of the project would be an acre. It's essentially a big battery that's going to store electricity by connecting to Central Hudson substation, which is adjacent to the property. It will not generate any new energy. It's simply a storage mechanism of electricity from the grid to be saved for a more valuable time, like when electricity is very expensive. When it's going to be used at that valuable time, it will be supplied and transmitted to the grid, Central Hudson substation. For example, if there's a power outage, this battery can provide electricity during the times of that power outage. Or, as I referred to earlier, that when the price of electricity is extremely high during some season of time, this energy can be stored to support that lack of energy and the expensive nature of the energy, hopefully lowering the cost of electricity to consumers. It would also make better use of wind and solar energy, since those energy sources are inexpensive, but you can't necessarily choose when it's windy or when it's sunny. The location is a perfect spot because it's adjacent to Central Hudson substation, which the project needs to connect to. The benefits of the project are helping reduce the cost of electricity, and we've seen projects, or East Point Energy has seen projects in Virginia where the project has been able to reduce very expensive peak charges and save money for consumers. The project would reduce the need for new utility power lines. There will be more reliability when it comes to electricity. It can reduce blackouts or brownouts. And it can ensure that electricity is provided at proper voltages and currents to protect local homes and business equipment. And because because of the retirement of Indian Point in Westchester, there's just in general less firm energy in the region, so this would supplement the lack of energy in the region. So focusing on the town code and the definition of public utility facility, first, this will be an installation used by a public agency or specially franchised public utility to supply or transmit electricity. East Point will contract with Central Hudson in order to connect to their substation. Essentially, Central Hudson will tell East Point Energy how to connect and how much it's going to cost for them to connect to their substation. The project will not be viable if East Point is not connecting to Central Hudson's substation. Additionally, there could be a financial contract with Central Hudson. Later on this year, Central Hudson may put out a request for a proposal. We don't know that yet, but most likely they will, based on New York State's movement towards different renewable energy requirements. And if the request for a proposal is put out, then East Point Energy will participate in that proposal in order to sell electricity to Central Hudson. NYSERDA, if you aren't aware, NYSERDA has certain goals to deploy certain amounts of storage of energy storage in New York State, and New York State is actually one of the states that has the largest storage energy requirements. If they are unsuccessful in contracting with Central Hudson for a financial contract in order to provide them with electricity, then they will sell electricity through New York Independent System Operator. Simply, East Point wouldn't exist and this project wouldn't exist if it wasn't supplying energy to public agencies and especially franchised public agencies. And just another point, the definition requires that an installation be used by a public agency or specially franchised public utility to supply or transmit electric. It does not require that the installation be owned by the public agency or specially franchised public utility. And there should be no dispute that East Point Energy is operating for public services to provide the public electricity more reliably and in a more efficient manner, and hopefully in a more cost-effective manner. There's an exclusion in the town code's definition, which excludes a power plant. This is not a power plant. The definition goes on to include certain facilities, which one is a substation. The substation is directly adjacent to, or is adjacent to this property. This installation is very similar, although it's not the same. It is similar to a substation in that the installation is going to be doing a lot of the same work as a substation, as it's going to be connecting to it and basically enhancing the existing substation. It's going to be enhancing it by providing and supplementing electricity and storing the electricity when it's not being used. So the substation is changing voltages and distributing electricity. This installation would be storing the electricity. If you feel that it still isn't clear as to whether this project falls within a public utility facility under the Pleasant Valley Town Code, then you aren't alone, because over the last 2 years, East Point Energy has received three opinions from the zoning administrator on the interpretation of whether East Point is a public utility facility, even though nothing has changed in terms of the project. Zoning codes are a derogation of the common law and must be strictly construed against the municipality and in favor of the property owner in accordance with their ordinary meetings. Ambiguities, if any, are to be resolved in favor of the applicant or property owner. Clearly, we've received one interpretation that said that East Point Energy was in fact a public utility facility. A little while later, a new zoning administrator came on board, and we received another interpretation, the same interpretation, that East Point Energy is a public utility facility under the town code. Then on October 4th, 2022, we received the different determination from the zoning administrator saying that East Point Energy was not a public utility facility. So clearly, there are ambiguities in the town law because there's different interpretations by the zoning administrators. I did look at the town code and to find reference to battery storage facilities or energy storage facilities. I could not find any. I was before the planning board maybe about a month ago, I don't remember the exact date, on this issue as it was deferred to the planning board for their comment. And the planning board had some concerns, but one of their concerns was that they were afraid as to what this would open the door to, because this would be in a residential district. But I want to remind you that the Zoning Board of Appeals is not a board of precedent, and all decisions are made on their own facts. Moreover, your definition in the town code does give exclusions as to what is not provided for a public utility facility, and those are power plants and gas wells, and also utility distribution facilities serving customers directly. So there is a distinction of what is allowed and what is not allowed. Moreover, now that, additionally, there's a reason why this location is so desirable to East Point Energy. This project and all battery storage projects have to connect to the local power grid through a substation with adequate capacity to accommodate the transmission between the battery storage facility and the grid. So the greater the distance between the battery storage facility and the substation, the less efficient the transmission will be. As a result, we see a lot of substations that are in residential districts, which is why this specific location is a great location for this project. Other towns have, because renewable energy is fairly new, other towns have implemented battery storage facilities in their zoning regulations to provide for them. Some allow those in residential districts, some do not. But the ones that do allow them in residential districts, there's certain requirements that have to be met, and simply determining that East Point Energy is a public utility facility does not prevent East Point Energy from having to go before the planning board and meet all the requirements that the planning board is going to make them to meet in terms of complying with safety and anything else that the planning board is going to request. When we were last here before the Zoning Board of Appeals, probably 2 months ago, there was a question as to how a public utility facility is defined in other towns or in other areas. So there is a case from the Court of Appeals, Cellular Telephone Company versus Rosenberg, that define a public utility as a private business, often a monopoly, which provides services so essential to the public interest as to enjoy certain privileges such as eminent domain and be subject to such governmental regulation as fixing of rates and standards of service. Characteristics of the public utility include the essential nature of the services offered, which must be taken into account when regulations seek to limit expansion of facilities which provide the services, operation under a franchise subject to some measure of public regulation, and logistic problems such as the fact that the product of the utility must be piped, wired, or otherwise served to each user. The supply must be maintained at a constant level to meet minute-by-minute need, and the user has no alternate source, and the supplier commonly has no alternate means of delivery. This is a very broad definition and has resulted in the application of it to less traditional public utilities such as cellular telephone companies and renewable energy projects. This project meets all the factors as discussed in that case. The project is owned by East Point Energy, a private energy company which operates to provide clean and renewable energy to the grid to consumers. It cannot be argued that electricity is not essential to everyday life, and the project and the rates that are charged will be regulated by the Public Service Commission, because they will be distributing energy to the grid, which is subject to the public regulation. Lastly, the product can only be distributed by way of the electric grid. There's no other feasible method for electricity provider to deliver electricity to consumers. I have that case that I can provide to everyone if they'd like, that I cited from the Public Utility Facility. I also have case law on zoning codes being a derogation of the common law and must be strictly construed against the municipality when it comes to ambiguities. So I can hand those out, but we respectfully request that you find that East Point Energy is a public utility facility as defined by your own town code. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, but I'll pull out.
I would just like a piece of that,
Yep.
a copy of that. Here's that you quoted. Thank you very much. Might as well hand it down. Thank you.
It's on page 4, the definition of public utility facilities.
Thank you.
I'm just going to hand this one to.
Thank you.
May I ask you a few questions here? I'm sure other people have a lot of questions as well. And correct me if I did not hear you correctly. You do not have any contract with Central Hudson, correct?
Correct. There will be a contract to connect to their substation, and there may possibly be, as I referenced, they might be putting out a request for a proposal, because New York State, as of recent, New York State has put a lot of requirements on electric companies to contract with places like East Point with respect to energy storage in order to get New York to meet their goals of 70% of energy storage.
So you don't actually have an agreement with them?
No.
No. What makes you certain that you will have one?
So we would be paying Central Hudson in order to connect to their substation. So there would be no reason that there's no other battery storage facility that connects to that substation. So there would be no reason why Central Hudson would not want to provide us a contract to at least connect with the substation. And based on New York State's legislation, Central Hudson would, at least New York State would very much support the fact of a financial contract with East Point Energy to provide them with electricity.
Have you had those discussions with Central Hudson yet?
No.
And if Central Hudson decides not to buy services from you, would you still build the facility?
So if Central Hudson decides to not provide us with a contract to connect to their substation, then the facility would most likely not be built because there would be no substation to connect to. But again, there's no other battery storage facility that connects to that substation, so I don't see why Central Hudson would not allow that. With respect to if Central Hudson is not willing to enter into contract in order to purchase electricity from East Point, then East Point would sell the electricity through New York Independent Service Operator.
You would sell from that battery storage unit of yours to another utility. Is that what you're saying?
It would still connect to the substation and have to go through the substation to the grid, but the energy would be sold through New York State's Independent Service Operator.
To put it kind of bluntly, as you said, your client is a for-profit corporation, right? You're owned, I believe, by a Norwegian, like the largest utility company in Norway. And in essence, if I can boil it down to the simplest thing, when there is not a lot of power being used, you will be buying the power from Central Hudson, i.e. cheaper.
Correct.
When there is a demand for more power, you will then sell it back, am I correct?
Yes.
And there's nothing wrong with the American way, buy it cheap and sell it high. But nevertheless,
But we've
I
seen.
don't see the benevolence of such an arrangement, but that's just me.
So the rates would be governed by the Public Service Commission because they govern all contracts where the sale of electricity is to someone like Central Hudson. So those rates would be governed. And ultimately, the hope is, projects like this exist because the hope is to pass along the cost-saving effects to the consumer eventually.
I don't understand how that's cost effective. It seems to me like you're adding a middle person or a second or third middle person.
Well, you're generating more electricity, or storing the electricity. When the electricity is not being used and it's just sitting there and it's going to waste, you're taking that electricity and you're storing it so it can be put into the grid at a more valuable time when there's a blackout.
At a more valuable price to East Point, right? You're not going to sell it back for the same amount that you charge them to begin with. So you charge them to give it to you, correct?
Yes.
And then you charge them to give it back to them.
Yes, you're buying and selling, correct. But those rates are, the contract to buy electricity is governed by the Public Service Commission, so those rates need to be just and reasonable.
Do you have any facility anywhere else in the county or in New York State?
Not in New York State, no.
In Virginia?
Yes.
Yes, we found the one in Virginia.
How much land did they give you in order to do that storage? Because how many acres do you have here?
So we're in an option contract, so we're not the property owner yet. but we have, I believe the property is 1.9 acres, and the footprint of this project would be 1 acre.
How much?
I mean, subject to the planning board.
do you have?
Microphone, please.
I'm sorry. How much property in Virginia
I'm not
is
sure.
required in order for you to provide this utility?
I'm not sure because this is a 10 megawatt project. So the project in Virginia, I'm not sure what megawatt project that is. But with the 10 megawatt project here, we're proposing a 1 acre footprint.
Hey, I have spoken to NYSERDA too. I mean, are you willing to, or have you gone through their regulations in order to actually provide this service? Because I know that there were a few things that they mentioned in reference to it. Another thing that they mentioned that which should be a concern of ours is our fire regulations, that we need to speak to our fire marshal in reference to this project.
Mhm. So with regards to fire safety, and the applicant had reached out, East Point Energy had reached out to the member of the fire committee to have a conversation with them. They did not return his call, but this company does provide the training to the fire departments to, respond to a call if necessary. They're at East Point Energy's cost. And there's no special equipment or anything that's required that we know of that's required in order to respond to a fire. But if there was, then East Point Energy would provide that equipment and obviously the training to the fire department at their cost.
I do have in front of me the Fire Advisory Board comments from their meeting, and they deny the request of this project to move forward, and while their denial isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all, they are expressing very, very strong concerns on the project. And if I may ask you, the last thing I had heard was this would provide approximately 3 to 4 hours of energy to the village if there's a necessity. Am I correct?
Yes,
Okay.
if there's a power outage.
Right. You are aware that this project will sit on top of the Iroquois gas pipeline, right?
I'm sure East Point Energy is aware of that, yes.
Well, that scares the living bejeebers out of me, very frankly. But that would be for another day, and it is not necessarily a reason to say you are or are not a utility. I have a letter from Sarah, her last letter from the zoning administrator, which she said, I wish to withdraw and revise my February 14, 22 opinion regarding the battery storage facility which East Point Energy proposes for 12 Pleasant View Road, which is in the town of Pleasant Valley's low-density residential district, and also to retract an undated opinion of the prior zoning administrator, Tom Lane. The proposed battery storage facility, for which no application has been submitted, will be used by East Point to store electricity, which it will purchase and then transmit through the local utility, Central Hudson system, to the grid for sale, presumably through New York's independent system operator. Is that true? That's going through the ISO rather than directly to Central Hudson?
It depends whether Central Hudson puts out the request for a proposal, and if they do, whether East Point definitely will put out a proposal to Central Hudson in order to fulfill that, and New York State has put forth a policy of aggressive climate goals to reach 70% renewable energy by 2030. So this project would be in furtherance of those state goals. So Central Hudson would have, wouldn't be required to accept it, but they would have some pushing from the state in order to accept it. So if Central Hudson does not put out the proposal or does not accept the proposal from East Point, then they would be selling it through New York State independent operator.
So in either situation, in essence, the cost to the consumer then is going to be increased by your adder to the cost of electricity from Central Hudson, or?
Can you repeat that again?
Has to be.
So you're buying low and you're selling high, and the price that you sell to Central Hudson will have to be absorbed by the customer that's purchasing the electricity from Central Hudson.
Well, again, all contracts are governed by the Public Service Commission, and those rates have to be just and reasonable. So we're buying from Central Hudson when the cost of electricity is low. Yes, I mean probably at other times as well in order to store that electricity, but we're putting it back into the grid at cost not when the price is high, but when the demand for electricity is high. I can't say that the price is going to be high. I mean, it's going to be governed by the Public Service Commission in terms of what's just and reasonable. But I can't tell you what those prices will be.
How long does the battery packs maintain their charge?
It has a life. It's a 4-hour duration battery, and it's 10 meg. It can store 10 megawatts.
Have you taken record of how often Central Hudson goes out for 4 hours?
No.
Do you have some kind of record to make this venture of yours seem worthwhile? Shouldn't it be known?
I mean, the project has existed in other areas other than New York, and has been successful.
Which are the other areas again? Because I only heard just mention.
In Virginia.
That's it?
Yes.
Spotsylvania, Pennsylvania too. They have one. I have a question regarding your definition of an installation used by a public agency or a specially franchised public utility to supply or transmit. A battery facility does not supply or transmit. Transmission is done from the generator to the substation through the high voltage wires that you see, the lattice work or the monster towers that are up now. Substation to the end user is a distribution point. I do not see where a BESS or a battery energy storage system is generating, transmitting, or distributing electricity. It is merely storing it. So I'm having trouble figuring out where this fits in.
It's storing it and then putting it back into the grid.
It's not transmitting, it's not distributing, it's solely storing it.
Well, it's supplying electricity
It's
to...
storing it.
Well, I mean, there's no... I respectfully disagree with you. I don't know what else to say.
Well, you, in a statement before, you said that a battery energy storage facility, storage, that system, is a system that is comparable to a substation, which it isn't.
Well, I mean, obviously it's not exactly the same, because if it wasn't exactly the same, then we probably wouldn't have to be here, because it's included as a facility that is a public utility facility under your town code.
Right.
I said that there's some similarities, although it's not exactly the same, correct?
No, it's not the same, but I do not see where under this code it says store. It says
supply or transmit. The supply is coming from wherever we generate the electricity from, I don't know, Roseton or the old Indian Point or someplace else. They are the generators, they are the ones that supply electricity. This is actually taking electricity that's already been supplied and stored here. And then it goes to the substation, which distributes it out.
Yeah, and it's
So-
providing electricity at a later time that it's needed.
Yeah, but it's storing it.
It surprises me that Central Hudson doesn't do that on their own.
Well, yeah.
Well,
You know?
well, that's why New York State implemented the policy of the 70% renewable energy by 2030. They're hoping that Central Hudson and other electricity providers are going to either contract with facilities that do store energy, or they're going to create their own project.
So you are essentially saying you want to build this battery storage in Pleasant Valley, and maybe, if Pleasant Valley has no outages, Pleasant Valley gets no benefit from it. Not to mention the fact that I believe you said, and I know I looked at the planning board on YouTube, and approximately 9 minutes and 12 seconds into your presentation, you say, we are not a public franchise utility. So what you guys are saying you're not, and you're saying, but gee, zoning board, you should interpret it as us being a public utility. When you yourself say it's not, I don't understand. I'm sorry,
Let me-
I'm not
let me-
an attorney, but
Let me
I don't
clarify.
understand.
So that's because the way that the town code is written, it defines what a public utility facility is, but it says that an installation used by a public agency or specially franchised public utility. So the point is that we're not owned by a public agency, we're not owned by a specially franchised public utility, but we still fall within your town code definition of a public utility facility because we're an installation used by a public agency or specially franchised public utility to supply or transmit electricity.
So you're saying, you're saying that used by a public agency, we can actually say used by Central Hudson, is what you're saying, right?
Correct.
Public agency or specially franchised public utility, which Central Hudson is a special franchised public utility.
Correct.
So that's your point, is what I'm trying to get at. is that
Correct.
it's-
It does not say an installation owned by, it says an installation used by.
Right, so we have to determine if Central Hudson is actually even though there's no contract yet with Central Hudson, if Central Hudson is actually the user of this facility, or if East Point is the user and just supplying energy to Central Hudson, as needed. I mean, is that kind of what you're
Yes, so
asking?
it's whether East Point Energy is installation that's used by Central Hudson to supply or transmit electricity.
But Central Hudson.
Go ahead.
Central Hudson, though, you don't have an agreement with them yet.
That's
It just
correct.
surprises me that you would go through all this trouble without first getting an agreement with them. Because one thing I do know about utilities, they are scrutinized heavily by the government. So if you're operating lawfully, they would have to know that in order to let you partner with them. So I'm just wondering why you would go through all of this without first finding out if they're going to let you use their station,
Correct. So
substation.
it would be premature to have that discussion with Central Hudson because we haven't purchased the property yet. we were in contract, but we haven't purchased the property yet. And the property won't be purchased unless East Point Energy falls within, their battery storage facility falls within the definition of a public utility facility.
So you're not one at this point?
I'm sorry?
You're not a public service facilities at this point in time
As-
without a contract with Central Hudson?
As defined by your town code, we believe that we fall within a public utility facility.
Prior to having
Excuse
a
me,
contract.
it says utility distribution facilities serving customers directly are considered customary accessory uses, not public utility facilities. And that is at best what I think you do. You distribute either to Central Hudson or to customers, but you do not generate it, and therefore, by token of this last sentence, distribution are considered customary accessory uses, not public utility facilities. Excuse me.
I think that's where the ambiguity of this town code comes into play. So there's a lot of facilities, like substations or other facilities that could fall under utility distribution facilities serving customers directly. I think that might be talking about when a company owns the utility distribution facility and it's on their property and they're using it for their own use. But I think that's an ambiguity that exists within the town code.
I don't believe there's any ambiguity. I believe it's very clear. You're not supplying, you're not transmitting, you're not distributing. Energy's already been supplied, you're buying it, and then you're selling it back.
The energy is transmitted back to the grid.
It's not transmitted, transmission goes from the generating facility to the substation. Distribution goes from the substation to the end user, a business or a home.
So we respectfully, if there's no more questions, we respectfully find that you determined that the battery storage facility is a public utility facility as defined within your town code. And, just as a reminder, this is all subject to site plan approval. So you mentioned the fire safety concerns, which I'm certain would be addressed at the planning board and whatever issues there are, those will be complied with. And if they're not, then they're not going to get site approval.
And the fact that you're sitting on...
Microphone.
Oh, yes, thank you. The fact that you are sitting on probably the largest natural gas pipeline in the state people aren't concerned about that. I mean, and if they're unaware of it, then somebody isn't doing their due diligence.
And I'm sure that will be addressed at the site approval portion.
But should this board interpret in your favor, okay, then it's out of our hands. And I know that a number of these facilities out in the Midwest, for example, are concrete facilities, and I believe these are going to be metal facilities, metal storage.
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, because I can see battery explosions creating the world's largest shrapnel in an area in essentially what one might call a development, but in a residential area in any event. And I know that's not really the thing that we should be concerned about, but we have to. And I know we're here to give an interpretation, but there are other things that, God forbid something ever happened I don't know about anybody else, but I find it hard to live with myself. So that's my feeling, and that's strictly on the safety of the project, not interpreting it as a utility or not.
Just
So,
briefly with respect to the proposal of the metal facility, so obviously that's subject to planning board approval. So if the planning board says no metal, concrete, then East Point would take that under advisement and decide to go forward with the concrete or not with the project. And then, you know, with all due respect, and you pointed it out, we're here strictly on an interpretation of whether East Point Energy falls within the Town Code of Public Utility Facility.
okay.
If I could just say one thing, I would just, with all of this that you're discussing right now, I just stress that the board, when they come to their determination, only take into consideration matters of the interpreting the code and the determination letter when coming to your determination, and not include any extraneous factors that might come up through public comment or things that might be determined by the planning board should this go forward through site plan approval. That's all.
Understood.
Just curious, what is the cost of the project and the timeline?
We are 2 years out from when construction would start, taking into account planning board approval and all that. The cost of the project, I'm not sure.
Does anybody have any other questions or concerns before I open this meeting to the public? Or do we pretty much get it all at least answered?
Hmm?
Okay.
Think so?
Then let me open the meeting to the public and remind you, please, that any testimony you choose to give should be directed towards the board and not towards the applicant. We then will direct it towards the applicant. So is there anyone who would care to speak to the public? And may I have you raise your right hand? Do you swear or confirm or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
It will.
Thank you. And your name and address for the secretary, please?
Okay. I'm Stephen McNish. I live on Valley View Road, which is one of the roads above this project. And just for background, I was the energy coordinator at IBM for 12 years before I went to work as an energy paralegal with Couch White in Albany. There's a number of questions that come up as a result of this, one of which you've kind of addressed already, and that's the buying and selling of the energy. Unless Central Hudson has a contract with them, they will be buying the energy at the New York ISO's market clearing price and selling it back to them at the market clearing price. And the price would be lower in the middle of the night, on days when there isn't a high demand for air conditioning or heating or something like that. And then they would sell it back when the price is higher. I heard the terms energy renewable bandied about. This isn't renewable energy, excuse me. They're buying energy from the utility, storing it, and sending it back to them. Now, because they're not sending it to customers other than Central Hudson, that kind of makes them an electric power plant, which, if I read it, is excluded from this public utility facility. One of the comments that Mr. Dunn mentioned, it's a 1 acre site. The land itself is 1.9 acres. probably 3/4 of an acre is the gas right-of-way. So even if they're not building it over the gas right-of-way, it's right next to it. Something to think about. In addition to that, and this is a question more toward the notification process. This site is next to the only road for more than 50 homes. It really would have been worthwhile if every home on that roads, because it's Pleasant View, Valley View, and Cedar Lane, had been notified of this, not just the adjacent properties. Because if, heaven forbid, this sucker ever blows or burns, and we know that lithium-ion batteries, based on what we've seen with Tesla and their cars, they're a nasty fire to fight. And if it goes, it's apt to block our only access. My thoughts. Any questions? Thank you for your time.
Thanks, sir. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. And your name and address for the
Suzanne,
secretary?
excuse me, Suzanne Horn, 1971 Route 44. Pleasant Valley Code, Chapter 98, 103, defines a public utility facility as an installation used by a public agency or a specially franchised public utility to supply or transmit electric, gas, water, etc. The code further cites substations and high-voltage transmission lines as the means by which a public utility facility supplies or transmits electric. So the Tinkertown substation on Route 44 is an installation used by Central Hudson to supply and transmit electric power. The delivery system, comprised of a substation and high-voltage transmission lines, is an essential component to Central Hudson's ability to deliver electric power to its end users. East Point, by its own description, stores electricity in batteries. Battery storage, in and of itself, does not supply or transmit electric. You put electric into a battery before you take electric out of it. Although commercial battery storage is absent from the Pleasant Valley Code, the term warehouse is found in the code and is similar in function, namely something used for storage. A warehouse is a non-residential land use according to the Pleasant Valley Code and is prohibited in the low-density LDR zone. East Point is neither a public utility installation nor an installation to supply or transmit electric. The applicant is a commercial battery storage enterprise that seeks to use residential property it does not currently own, and moreover, exaggerates the derogation of landowner rights principle by asserting that a finding of ambiguity must favor the applicant. That's all I have.
I'm ready. I've been before you many times. My property's hot.
I know we are. Do you swear or affirm
Well,
that
we
the
don't.
testimony, well, she'll tell you in a moment.
Oh.
Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, The whole truth and nothing but the truth.
I do.
And would you please give your name and address to the secretary?
Allison Richards, 11 Pleasant View. I'm across the street. I have been here so many times over the last few years, it's becoming annoying. So here's the thing, couple things I will direct to you. The NISO comments about being able to benefit customers, probably have heard from town people. Central Hudson doesn't set the prices. The PSC does not regulate supplier prices. You could sell whatever you want to sell at. That's why customers are getting crazy bills, because Central Hudson doesn't govern that. PSC doesn't govern that. It's for profit. Some suppliers went bankrupt over the summer, and they no longer can sell in New York State. So what happens when you're buying low and selling high, and then you bankrupt? We have this huge battery in our town. What are we doing with that? The other thing I wanted to mention, I mean, I have a family next door. I am not into this at all. Right when we moved in, maybe a year or two after, the transformer across the street caught on fire, blew up. Central Hudson had to come and, take up dirt and land and everything and whatever. When it was on fire, the fire company came. They did not touch it. They said they could not touch it. Central Hudson had to touch it. So you're telling me that they're going to train the firemen. Volunteer firemen are going to go through training and then have to deal with an acre-large battery if something were to happen to it that's sitting next to a natural gas line. I don't understand how that's possible, how that's, they're going to wait for Central Hudson. So Central Hudson's going to have to deal with that. I'm just a little taken back that this would even happen. I mean, I would love for something to happen to that property because it is an eyesore, but not this. But that's all I have to say. It's not good.
I can appreciate what you're saying. Realize that anybody who wants to do anything certainly has the right to request.
Oh, I know. The last time I was here with the neighbor with the two-family house,
I remember.
my only thing was that they call me if they have dogs. There's 3 dogs next door, and nobody called me. So that they never contacted me. They're not saying boo about me. I know it's separate, but it's every time I come, you guys make a decision, and you don't see what it impacts the community. The community's telling you. I know what the code says, but it doesn't fit in the code. That's not what it is. It's not fitting, in my opinion. It doesn't fit. There are battery storage. So you're buying it from Central Hudson to sell back. You're for profit. So any money you're putting into it, you're going to try to get more money out of it. That's why would you do business if it wasn't for profit? And you're not going to. Did you contact the PSC? Did you ask the state their opinions of it? You don't just say there are programs and then this is how you're going to get into the door with Pleasant Valley. Like, what does the PSC say? Do they agree? Do they think it's a good idea? Once you get that information, you have no supporting documentation of anything. You don't even know how much it's going to cost, what other facility, how big it is. You're not giving any information for anyone to make a determination. I know it's only solely what the code is. Maybe that's the planning boards, but this doesn't seem right to me. Thank you.
Anyone else care to speak to this application? Hearing no other responses, I will close the public portion of the meeting, and I would like to get everybody's feelings on this.
So moved on closing the public hearing.
Oh, thank you. Second,
I didn't hear what she said.
she moved to close the public hearing.
Okay, second.
Okay. All right, I'm looking for
first of all, the code does not cover battery or storage of electricity, which in my mind is the main theme of this. And the storage is not of electricity in batteries specifically, is not addressed in the code, I think because they didn't know about it when the code was written. Now, there's such a thing, and perhaps our attorney would like to explain to the audience the difference between a permissive code and a prohibited code. I have it written out of it. Okay. A permissive code is.
I don't wanna do something where,
Okay. A permissive code is when a code is written and it addresses all of the things and uses that are permitted in your code. For instance, our code tells us that you can have this and this and this and this in our code. If it's not mentioned, it's considered prohibited. Now, that's how I am interpreting our code. Is that right? Mr. Okay.
No, I agree that, yeah, specifically,
If it's
there's-
not mentioned specifically, then it is considered prohibited. So it's not mentioned, so my interpretation is that it is prohibited. To me, that is if it's prohibited, that's it. Not only that, in this zone, this low density zone, when you go through all of the allowed uses, one of the uses that is prohibited because it's not in there is any kind of business. And to me, a business is somewhere where you profit from whatever it is you're doing. So to me, that's like 2 strikes that it's not allowed. And that's how I see it. I don't know how everyone else is going to see it, but that's how I see it. So in my estimation, it is not a public utility because of the storage factor, and it's not allowed. Someone else is up now.
I'm pretty much along that line too, except I look at it as a business, and as a business, it doesn't comply with our code wants. So I narrow it down to that.
What you just said, yeah.
Well, my issue is just whether or not it's being used by a public agency or specially franchised public utility. Who is the user? That was my big question. I think that the facility, the installation itself, is not being used by a public agency. It's actually being used by East Point to store energy and, sell it to Central Hudson or whoever. So that's my opinion on it. That's my take on it.
Anyone else?
I have a real issue with the factor that you do not have an agreement with Central Hudson. And you're saying it's too soon because you haven't gone through complete ownership of this land. And what was the other reason you gave for why it's too soon to?
I gotta open it. If she's gonna answer, I have to open this session.
I'm so sorry.
No,
I'm
no,
sorry,
no, no,
sorry.
it's okay.
Okay. That's my biggest issue because I know that if a Central Hudson agreed to this using their substation, they would make sure you're above board before they would let you do it.
I think I stated my thoughts, where it's not supplying, it's not transmitting. it's storing, and that is not covered, and is not pointed out in the code.
Would say I agree. I feel as though it's a storage. Sorry. It's, to me, storage, not supplying.
Anyone else have any input on this? Okay. You'll have to forgive me for a minute while I write a few things down here.
If I could just
Absolutely.
statement. I just want to quickly run through before you guys vote on anything. Just the, your statements as to what you all just said. So it is not a public utility because it is a storage facility and storage is not mentioned in the code, and is therefore prohibited. A few of you mentioned that. It is, within that same line, it's a business, so it is also prohibited. It is not being used by a public agency, it is being used by East Point, so it is also not a public agency and therefore prohibited. And I think that's it. Did I cover everything?
It doesn't, Mayor said it doesn't function as anything that the public utility does.
It
It
is not
doesn't transmit, it doesn't
supply.
supply,
It's not
supply.
supplying, not
Right.
transmitting, it's storing. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. I have a resolution dated March 22, 2023. Whereas correspondence was submitted to the zoning administrator dated November 2, 2022, requesting an interpretation from the Zoning Board of Appeals of the zoning administrator's October 5th, 2022 determination that the proposed battery storage facility could not be considered a public utility facility under the zoning code. And whereas an application was made to the Zoning Board of Appeals for an interpretation of subsection chapter 98-103B of the zoning code, specifically the definition of public utility facility, on January 11, 2023, and whereas a referral was made to the town planning board pursuant to the 98-96 for an advisory opinion, and subsequent meeting was held on February 13th, which was not the case, where a representative for the applicant appeared, and whereas the town planning board issued an advisory recommending that the ZBA, to the ZBA that they uphold the determination by zoning administrator Sarah Davis, and whereas virtually all board members say that this is not a utility, but a storage facility, and they also tend to agree that this is a business which is prohibited in an LDR. Now, therefore, be it resolved that after having reviewed the material presented by the applicant, prior written determinations from the previous and current zoning administrator, and the zoning code, that the proposed battery storage facility is not a public utility facility, as defined in subsection 98-103B of the zoning code, and that the October 5th, 2022 written determination of Sarah Davis is upheld. And I put that in a form of a motion.
So moved.
Second?
Secretary, please pull a roll.
Ms. Adams?
I agree.
Ms. Perkins?
I agree.
Ms. Baba?
Agreed.
Ms. Smith?
I agree.
Mr. Kish?
I approve.
Ms. Myers?
Agree.
And Mr. Dunn?
I agree. Sorry, folks, but our interpretation is that you are no utility.
Yes. No. You,
Who seconded?
I second.
yeah.
Thank you, Steve. Can't write everything. All right, that done, do we have minutes? Did you guys have minutes? Yeah.
There's still a draft on the second page. Or the, under the. Oh, no, have those. Those are not.
You did not?